between Bob and me,
Okay.
we'll take that. We'll have everybody.
Yeah, I think we probably should introduce ourselves. Bob, you want to start all the way around?
Yeah, sure. Robert Flanagan, Assistant City Planner.
Ryan Scrittoro.
William Cunningham.
Brian Skinner.
Bruce Chaplinsky.
Dave White.
Louise Provenzano.
Peter Del Mastro.
Alan Weiner, City Planner.
And I'm Glenn Cholder from Planometrics.
Which is why we're here. So I guess we just want to turn it over to Glenn.
Yeah, we'll turn it right over to Glenn.
Great. Well, Bristol's one of 38 towns in Connecticut that has separate planning and zoning commissions. So I've been asked to work with the city on preparing a plan of conservation and development, which is a long-term strategic view of the city and how it can and should grow in the future. And really the objective is to try to get to a common vision for the city so that people can all be working together to accomplish things to make the city an even better place in the future. Because you have a split planning commission and zoning commission, you really have two entities that deal with land use issues in the city. But the way the statutes are set up, the responsibility for adopting the plan rests with the Planning Commission. So they're the people I'm working with primarily, but because you guys get involved in land use and other issues, this is an opportunity for you to participate in the process and to identify things that either you think that the city can or should be focusing on, or suggestions or guidance for the future. Even in terms of changes to the zoning regulations or the zoning map, you would often refer to or get a report from the Planning Commission in terms of consistency with the Plan of Conservation and Development. So if there's things that have always said, you know, this is kind of funny or weird, it's a great time to bring them up. What we talk about today will go into my thought process in terms of preparing materials for the Planning Commission. I'm not sure that what we talk about today will necessarily end up in the plan, but I think it's a great opportunity to talk about the future of the city, the issues that you see. And so I'm here today to talk, listen, take notes, etc., in terms of things that you think are important.
Following this meeting, will we have an opportunity to come back to you with any questions or additional thoughts?
Absolutely. I think through this process, we're working right now, we've broken the plan down for discussion purposes with the Planning Commission into three main components. The first component we're calling conservation strategies, and what that really is, it's a plan of conservation and development, so that's where conservation strategies came from. There's really things that we think the city should have strategies about things they want to protect or preserve. So we've talked with them already about things like natural resources and open space and community character and community assets and undeveloped land and just things that really kind of contribute to the quality of life in the city. The next major topic which we'll be talking about is going to be development strategies. Plan of Conservation and Development. You don't know what the third one is yet, though, so I'll get there in a moment. But that deals with sort of downtown, how we approach residential development, how we approach business development, where it's happening, how it's happening. Do we have good rules in place to produce the outcomes we think are good for the city, or are there things we want to revisit? And the third major part of the plan I call infrastructure. And infrastructure is the types of services and facilities we think we should have in the city to produce the outcome we want, and includes things like community facilities, city hall, fire departments, police, schools, park and recreation, includes transportation, vehicles, pedestrians, bikes, and includes utility infrastructure as well. So those are kind of the main themes of the plan, or the way we're going through it, and some of the main topics. And I think any of those or any other issues that are of concern to you are things really for us to talk about today.
Glenn, did you want to just mention about the tight timeline that we're on?
Yeah, the state has adopted a legislation that now requires municipalities have plans which are not more than 10 years old. So Bristol's current plan is 2001. So because the state legislation kicks in July 1 of next year, our intent is to have a plan adopted by July 1 of next year. And that way, we won't be ineligible for state discretionary grants. And that could be things such as funding for fire stations or open space or other things like that. And as a result of the timeline, we're really proceeding on the basis of an update of this document. There's much in here which we found still to be relevant, and we're looking to update it and enhance it for where we go from there.
So today, will you be presenting us with the significant changes that are
We're early enough in the process that what I'd like to do is to give you guys an opportunity to have a free-form discussion about things that you have thought about or things that we need to talk about as a visual cue, if you will. these again are the conservation, development, or infrastructure strategies. So if there's things in your regulations, or, I mean, Alan and I not too long ago were just talking about parking in the downtown. If you think, it's always bothered me that we seem to have this or that, or just other things related to the development patterns in the city, etc. I wanted to give you guys a chance to share those thoughts for consideration as part of the plan.
I think one of the, this may seem a little bit alien to the commission because you're dealing, on a month-to-month basis mostly with zoning regulations, but a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that your zoning regulations are probably, if not the most important tool, it's certainly a primary tool in implementing the plan of conservation and development, so that what you do clearly has an impact on the ability of the city to carry out some of the goals, policies, and recommendations in this plan. There are obviously other boards and commissions that may have, whose actions may have an impact, but you have a very primary impact in terms of land use and development. And I think a good example of that recently, whether the public at large agrees or disagrees with it, is your decision to eliminate from your downtown regulations the provision that allows drive-up windows. And that was very much, although that was very, in one sense, very matter-of-fact, that you had a regulation that said that by special permit you can have a drive-up window in the downtown business zone. Your action really implemented a policy decision that you had made based in some part on what the current plan of conservation development says. So that what you do, either consciously or maybe subconsciously, is in some degree a result of what the city's plan of conservation and development is. And I guess asking you to switch gears a little bit tonight is, rather than be talking about the details of regulations, we want to talk about the policies and the goals and the recommendations that are in place or should be in place, or what the Planning Commission should be thinking about based upon your experience with your zoning regulations and the use of the plan to help implement those regulations.
No, go ahead.
I heard you.
I'll jump in. I'll jump in because I'll hold the question.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the zoning map or the zoning regulations, do you think you have good zones in good locations? Are there anything about the regulations that you've always wondered about, or wonder if that's a good strategy, something that we should be looking at?
No.
We've recently made a number of significant changes to the regulations. Part of the process of the downtown development, the work we've done with Renaissance folks in coming up with and modifying regulations for the downtown area and for the transition zone. So we've spent as a commission, we've recently, fairly recently, spent a lot of time revising some of our regulations to gel with some of the planning that's going on.
And I think this is a continuation of that type of opportunity to try to gel the planning with the other stuff that's going on to make sure that we have good tools, et cetera, in place.
Yeah, I think that's where I was going and what I was going to ask more seasoned commissioners here, because I'm fairly new, just maybe 6 months, I think. And I would love to hear from Al, everyone here who's got the experience where we feel we stumble a little bit in meeting where the zoning regulations, if any, might not meet up to where the planning and development, is dictates. Like our hands are tied, are our hands tied anywhere, meaning the zoning commission and our regulations, when it comes to, say, underneath infrastructure, walking, biking, and bus. I know that there was a lot of talk in downtown and what's that group here that you could vote online on what to do downtown, and a lot of people wanted like a bike route around the outside, and I mean, even if it wasn't one of the top ideas that made it, I guess I want to know that if a group comes to us, if a business, an individual comes to us and has a great idea, it supports actually the plan of conservation development, have you seen anything that, you know, is difficult for that to jive with our zoning regulations? Or do you think we've done enough work where we do now align?
Well, there's always room for improvement, that's for sure, but like Peter says, we've really done a lot of work, especially on Route 72 and all those zones that
Well,
we
they're-
changed.
well, that's
A very
a
good
good
example
That's
of
another
what
example.
we've done here.
Yep.
Yeah.
We've changed all of that, and I think for the plus, which was really good. So that's something we have done. Some of the stuff we really can't control, but as a zoning approach, but as for a zoner, I think we've done a heck of a job these last couple of years.
I think it's been proven time and time again that our zoning regulations are good.
They are.
And I base that on the fact that almost all the time that I've been on, they work. And where there needs to be tweaking, there has been no hesitation to do so.
Right. Yeah. That's another thing good about the board. We're not afraid to voice your own opinion. Right or wrong, you don't have to vote with the flow. You know, you can voice your own opinion and vote against the flow if you like. Because I think that's an important thing. You know, we don't need everybody just with the same mindset all the time. We need to hear different opinions from everybody. That's an important thing.
And staff, I mean, staff is in the front line of what walks through the office and what's being filed. Do you see anything that, from your opinion, might not align with currently our zoning regulations and the plan, conservation development?
Well, I think to the credit of this commission, both, you know, as it's presently constituted and in the past, as Bruce has indicated, this is a commission that is always, and Dave has indicated, this has been a commission that has been willing to at least consider changes in the way people do business, for example. The way business and industry works today is different than the way it worked 20, 25 years ago. There are businesses that exist now that didn't, and industries that exist now that didn't exist back when this plan was done or when the current regulations were initially drafted. And I think this commission has been willing to consider changes in the regulations to reflect those changes in the way business does business and the way manufacturing is done and the like. As Bruce said, I think there's always room for improvement. There are always going to be these are not a static set of zoning regulations, and I think that that's due in part in a willingness to understand that things change, technologies change, the way people do business changes, and the commission has been willing to consider amending its regulations to keep up with that. But there may be things, I think where this gets tricky sometimes is there just may be land uses, for example, that, you know, are starting to materialize in other parts of the country that, you know, didn't exist 5 years ago. And how do you prepare for those, and how do you identify them? And it seems to me that, you know, that may be something that comes out of this plan of conservation development, recognizing that there are changes in technology that have to be, that your regulations have to be able to respond to changes in the workplace and in the community and the global economy that may not have had to deal with 10, 15, 20 years ago.
A good case in point would be the marijuana building.
Well, scoping like a true planner, though. You're talking, I mean, that's classic.
That's all we do.
It's, yeah.
But no,
That's a perfect example.
that's a
because
good you're right. I mean,
that's about as new as we can get, the concept.
yeah, I mean, 5 years ago, you know, no one was talking about medical marijuana, and you know, we were able to address that issue from a zoning standpoint.
While other communities have struggled with it.
Yeah,
Right.
and worse than struggling with it, I mean, have been very adversarial about it, and while this commission wasn't promoting it, I think you took a very sensible approach on how to deal with that. But there are going to be other, you know, I think an example that I can think of where it's not even necessarily, well, it is a change in technology in a way, is that translates down to something that's kind of mundane in your regulations, or can be, is parking requirements.
Right.
I mean, think of manufacturing facilities from 30 years ago, and think of manufacturing facilities today, and how many fewer people are needed to do the same job. Well, that translates into something as simple from this commission standpoint as, well, do we need to have as much parking on these sites anymore? Do we need to require as much parking? Are there things that you don't need anymore in your regulations, or things that you do need in your regulations that you didn't anticipate? It's kind of hard to sometimes look that far ahead, but I think that's kind of the purpose of this exercise.
It is, and I think parking is a good one too, because situations have changed over time. Cars have gotten smaller compared to way back. But we're also the internet these days, so that has changed the way that people park. Office occupancy situations have also changed. The technology has consumed square footage. You don't need to park for a computer. So mixed uses in our downtown, that sometimes we have parking needs that overlap at different times. So in fact, we can adjust our parking standards to reflect mixed use situations. So having these kinds of tools in place could help you and could also help the city.
That's like the schools that they're closing, or the hospital in a residential zone that needed parking that we had a problem with. And they're taking houses down to increase their parking is something else that we have to look through other development. It's kind of tough when you have a hospital in a residential zone or a school that's being closed in a residential zone. What do you do with that particular building, and how do we plan for the future of those buildings?
I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a little bit is that even under development here, this is kind of a rough outline, but I do think that the plan might have a chapter in it, and we'll talk to the Planning Commission about it, about the concept of institutional development. Because there are institutions that can have impacts in residential areas or even commercial areas, and those can include things like the hospital, which has got a sort of own set of issues in a residential neighborhood. We also have situations, I'm not so much sure in Bristol because I haven't looked at it in detail yet, but in some other communities where commercial space is being occupied by churches, which are nonprofit entities. So this is space which is important to the community, and it's disappearing. So do our regs allow churches in commercial zones, or should we, are we concerned about this? Is it something we should address? And again, these are sort of, as Alan pointed out, some of the policy issues that the Plan of Conservation and Development is a great place to talk about these kinds of things.
I'm a process kind of guy, and in trying to understand the relationship between the zoning commission and the planning commission, I bought into the concept where the planning commission does the plan, and zoning is the mechanism by which the plan gets implemented. So what we have to be sure we have is a good process whereby the information flows to the zoning commission from planning on an ongoing basis, because there are changes, and if we're only going to change this plan once in 10 years, but the world changes faster than that, there has to be a way to get updated information to the zoning commission for us to consider in terms of the changes that might be required for the zoning regulations.
Yep.
Correct.
And I think that just two things I wanted to talk about that. I get your point about sort of making sure we maintain a continuing dialogue between the boards, because they do need to work effectively with each other. But I also want to sort of reiterate one of the reasons why I feel I'm here today. You're absolutely right that under good land use programs, the strategic vision for the city typically falls to the Planning Commission to sort of set the direction, if you will.
Right.
But even if we make this akin to a sailing ship, the captain or the crew is going to decide we're going west, right? Well, that still means the people who have to row or do the work can have opinions about whether or not that was such a good call. And that's kind of why I'm here today, is that while the Planning Commission may sort of set some strategic visions and the Zoning Commission is in charge of implementation, if you've got thoughts about whether or not the visions and the strategies are wise or not, this would be a great time. Having said that, we're early in the process. We're working through. We expect to have a draft plan together late fall, and at that point in time, we would welcome your continuing feedback as we go through the process. Adoption will probably occur sometime May or June of next year. We're going to take the time that's available to do a good job, but I don't want you to feel undue pressure that this is your only opportunity. There will be multiple opportunities down the road.
Yeah.
But I think this is an opportunity to be proactive
Yep.
as opposed to just reactive to something that's already on paper.
Yep.
There's two, the guys were mentioning, the commission members are mentioning two of the things that we've been working on recently. There's two other things that, in my short time on the commission, have always been kind of like hot button issues, if you will. One of them is earth removal operations, and the other one is preservation of historic buildings in the city. And to me, those two items are something that really, because they always seem to come up. We've had issues with preservation of historic structures, and we've had issues with earth removal operations. Now, it doesn't seem like major earth moving operations will occur anytime in the near future, but who knows? Somebody might want to open up somewhere in Bristol and start digging. So, we, in association with like the Inland Wetlands Commission, who's been kind of monitoring one site in particular, but we're kind of kept in the loop on that also. So I think earth removal, and I particularly want to push for the preservation of historic buildings because of what did happen with a Terry House, right? That
Yes,
was
the Middle Street project.
yeah,
Yeah.
that the commission got somewhat burned on, and we lost a historic structure that there's no getting it back. So that would be one. The historic buildings is something that I think.
So talk to me a little bit about what happened on that one, because I think sort of one of the fundamental private property rights is that people get a chance to say, look, it's my building, it's my property, and we can have tools and regulations in place for demolition delay, but to sort of tie somebody's hands and say you can't do anything is sort of a level of government action which tips a balance sometimes.
Well, what if you have like a historic district and a certain area of historical, buildings that are, mean a lot to the community? In other words, they have a lot of historical significance to Bristol, say.
Yeah.
And if that area was designated as like a, how they can designate national parks, and you
Yep.
can't do anything in national parks. If you could designate, a historic zone somehow, because that's important to the history of Bristol, thereby limiting what can and cannot be done to those houses.
Okay, and the plan, we've talked this through the Planning Commission already, because that was sort of in our discussion already, the conservation issues under special resources. And the Planning Commission shares your concern about historic resources and the character of the city, so they care about it.
Yep.
The plan is going to advocate for the preservation of these resources to kind of set the character of the city, that we don't march off in kind of funky directions, that we remain true to our heritage, etc. We did talk about some of the tools that are available in terms of demolition delay, local historic districts, National Register historic districts, and village districts. And each have their advantages and disadvantages. And a demolition delay is the one, there is no right under enabling legislation to have a demolition prevention ordinance.
Right.
You can't tell somebody. But through municipal acquisition or incentives and carrots in the zoning regulations, there are communities that allow and encourage adaptive reuse of structures, provided the historic character is maintained.
Right.
And those are the types of things I think can be a really good interplay between the goal of preserving character and historic resources, and there might be some tweaks in the zoning regulations that could help us accomplish that.
In addition to the Terry House.
Could I just, Terry House, that's what I needed to write down. I'm sorry, keep going.
A more recent one was with the Bristol Hospital's parking.
Right.
And that was one of the issues that was raised by the general public, was that it's a old historic district, and they're knocking down houses to pay
Put up
for
a
it.
parking lot.
Without going too far afield, local historic districts are not within your jurisdiction. They're within the jurisdiction of a historic district commission. And the process for establishing historic districts is completely removed from the zoning commission.
Well, and
Well, how
that's what I
do we
wanted to
preserve
ask,
that?
though, is you have to go through a process to get an area or a house or a specific area or a building listed as historic, and unless it is.
Correct.
Can't do it.
Right, though we did have, it's apart from this in Bristol Hospital, it was a special permit to do that, and we had our discretion whether or not our planning and conservation plan, our conservation and development plan supported us doing that or not. That was a decision this commission could make at the time, if that special permit would be allowed, and why we supported it.
We also have four other, the Terry House is a pain in my neck, but it's a done deal, it's gone. But now we have 4 institutions here that are coming up before long. We got vacant schools, we got Memorial
Right.
Boulevard
Yeah.
School.
O'Connell's
That's a-
You
that's
know,
a
we've
large
got a
concern
lot
of
of
mine.
people screaming and hollering because that's an older building.
That was in front of
You've got
Planet.
Jennings School. Now you got O'Connell School and you've got Bingham School. So you got 4 schools now. You know, I know that for us, Terry House was a big problem. The problem is, it's gone. I mean, it's done. It's a done deal. But now you've got 4 of those, and I think those are going to be important.
Well, but my suspicion is that the future of those buildings is going to be decided before this plan is done. I think Bruce has really spoken to the bigger issue, which is what's happened with the reason these 4 schools have changed. In part, I mean, I know there were 2 new schools built, but in part it's a reflection of the changing demographics of the community. So I think that Bruce probably put his finger on it, that as the demographics of the community, of any community, change over time, things that the community needed or had during a period of time, there's no need for them anymore. There's less need for them. It happened in the 80s when the city, with Patterson School and other schools. So that's an ongoing issue. It doesn't happen all the time, but as a community evolves, the issues change and the need.
But Al, I mean, like, not to cut you off, but I don't think this commission needs a site to be listed as historic and go through that process. To find in our planning or what is it, the plan of conservation development, to find within that a reason for us to repurpose buildings and stop, like, you know, just to your point, our community is changing, the demographics are changing. Find a way within our zoning commissions, which is supported by the conservation plan, to repurpose these buildings for something else.
But you can't repurpose the buildings.
No, but it will come to us. What I'm saying is, it will come to us. Anything can come to
There's
us.
2 levels of this discussion. One of
Right.
which is
Anything
the
can-
actual function of the zoning commission. I
Right.
think Alan's saying
Right.
is, we don't really have a zoning regulation dog in that fight, but I think I've taken
Right.
your point as a bigger picture issue, really from all of your comments,
Right.
that historic resources are important to the city, and we need to
Right.
find and make sure we have good tools in place.
Good tools in place so that if it comes its way, it's not my decision on how we repurpose it, but from what you brought up with Bristol Hospital was a good point. That was a legitimate concern that that area, the residents of that area had, that this doesn't jive with what this neighborhood did. And it was at our discretion. I don't believe our hands were tied. It's a special permit.
Let me suggest that rehashing specific applications is really, I hear what everybody's saying, but it's really counterproductive to where you're trying to go
Well,
forward.
hang on a second. I'm getting
No, because
the concept here. The concept here.
It's the concept.
Yes, I agree.
Where in the present plan does it say that we should, as a commission, have acted to protect those buildings that were knocked down? I mean,
Yeah.
we had the power because it was a special permit.
Right, oh, absolutely.
We had the
Hang on a
power.
second.
That's my, yeah, right.
Right, and that's a
where
good
this-
point.
this-
But
this
but unless we have something to hang our hat on,
And to go
we
look
can't
in the-
just go ahead and deny it because we don't think it's right.
Right.
So where was it in
tools you
today's,
have-
in the plan? There has to be a connection, so we can say, well, you know, the plan says we've got to do this, so we're going to do this. You know what I mean? So if we were to deny it,
I think
because
you're-
we'd have raised holy hell if we denied it.
I want to make sure that your special permit criteria have standards in them that
They
you
do.
can
They
consider.
do.
Then you've got good tools in
That was
place.
discretionary.
Right.
But you cannot,
That was at our
as
discretion.
a zoning commission,
That was, yes.
you cannot prohibit the demolition of a historic building.
Exactly.
Because
No.
the property owner can do that. It's one of their property rights. So what we want to do is try to make sure that there aren't incentives in the regulations that the.
The special permit.
And we've done that too.
Yeah.
We've done it along Route 72 for some buildings. We offered some perks in there if you would do this, you know, and it worked very well. And I think that's the future of the zoning board.
But the special permit was about having the park, not about knocking down or not knocking down the buildings. It was about whether or not they could expand their parking lot within the zone. And they required a special permit to do that. Am I getting this right, Alan?
Mhm.
Okay. So we were perfectly within our right to say, no, you can't expand the parking.
Yes.
You know, we didn't tell them, if they wanted to knock down the buildings and do nothing with them, that's fine, but they couldn't expand the parking, which is what they were looking for. But I wasn't aware of any, other than the fact that we had the power to do that.
Let me just,
What would be the legitimate reason for doing that if they met all the other criteria that they needed to get the special permit? If there was something in the plan that said, you know, we want to preserve historic buildings, or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So something we could have hung our hat on, the outcome might have been different if we could have been appointed. But I don't know that there's something in the plan, and it certainly wasn't brought to our attention.
I think
if there
that
is.
philosophically, in the new plan, we've already talked about this with the Planning Commission, and they have agreed that this is something which needs to be a strategy for the plan in terms of preserving historic resources and the character. How that then gets into your regulations will be the next step.
Right. I think there's, and I shouldn't be speaking for my fellow commissioners, but I think there's a consensus that we want to, in general, protect historic structures.
But I mean, we can't use the plan of conservation as a reason for rejection of anything. The plan of conservation is what we base our zoning regs on, and that's what we govern.
Right.
So we can't use that as a legitimate reason. We could say it doesn't seem to be in line, but you got to think of something. You got to get some other reason from the regs themselves as to why. So we can't just fall back on that.
You can for a zone change.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Certain things, but not for
Legislative decisions, the commission is
Correct.
required under the statutes to make a finding of consistency. And if you find it's inconsistent, then it takes a supermajority vote to approve. So it's not that you can't do it, it just makes it a little bit more challenging. There are some planning commission decisions in terms of subdivision layout where the plan of conservation and development can be used in a binding manner. But you're right, generally speaking, it's an advisory document which points out good things for the city to try to pursue. And that's really where it gets its strength and value, is that it's a flexible, long-term document which is advisory and provides a framework for all of these types of situations and decisions. That was a good discussion.
Just wondering, what were you talking about, referring to about what would be binding in the plan of conservation development?
If the plan shows a road connection, and somebody comes with a subdivision that doesn't connect the roads, the commission can turn it down for that purpose. The second thing is open space. If there's a desirable open space connection shown in the plan, somebody comes in the subdivision, proposes open space, but not in the location where you have identified it as being desirable, that can be used as a basis for modifying the plan, or in fact, rejecting it until it comes in with a more consistent open space configuration.
Glenn, we had, on a staff level, we were talking about open space, and I wanted to just sound out the zoning commission on their thoughts on open space. It doesn't seem to be talked about as much, but it is a very important component of the plan of conservation development. I'm just wondering what some of the thoughts are on open space. Preservation, creating open space, preserving what's there, creating connectivity between open spaces.
We don't have a lot of it, that's why. It's not a lot of area that we have open space.
There you go. More than you'd be surprised how much.
Yeah, there's quite a bit in the city.
We've been working on a map.
Oh, really?
It really is kind of surprising.
Way all the districts, though.
Well, it's actually in certain locations, parks we know about, Rockwell, Hoppers, etc. There are places we know, but there's actually a lot of other pieces of open space around that kind of provide a framework for us. And the value of the plan actually is to start mapping these things so that people can see and start to appreciate where our historic resources are, where our open space is, where the natural resources are, etc. Because this is how we can kind of pull our vision together.
Doesn't the state have a mapping on open space, I believe? Because I've gotten hit with that in New Britain.
They do have a map.
Okay, they were pretty badly.
How up to date and current
it's
is the challenge.
yeah.
So in fact, we had a meeting this afternoon to go through the city's parcel by parcel records to try to get a way to classify lands in town that we could agree could be considered open space, or might have an opportunity to provide for public access, or, you know, things like fish and game clubs. Fish and game clubs, is that open space or it's not? I mean, it's open space in the sense it may
Not
not
for
be...
me, I don't think Bristol accepts women still.
That's
That's another issue.
How about golf courses?
I mean, golf courses are open
They
space
are.
in the sense that you drive by and they're pretty and they're not really going to have buildings on them.
Correct.
But some clubs are private and don't allow for public access. So the question is, almost everybody, if I give you each a piece of paper and said, write down your definition of open space,
Right.
there'd be a lot of similarities, but there'd also be something perhaps unique about each of you. And so the challenge in putting together a community master plan is to try to agree on what we think our concept of open space is, to map that, and then talk about how we can try to promote as many open space amenities as possible for the city. And that could include public access, or it could include just, you know, protection from development. So the Fish and
Right.
Game Club can do what they want, but in the meantime, when we drive by, it's green and it's, you know, the hills, et cetera. So what is that? And that's what we're working on.
That's an interesting question, though, to a zoning commissioner on how do you feel about open space? I'm not too familiar with what our regulations...
I was just going to say, I'm
Yeah.
not sure that...
You actually,
How faced with it much.
you actually have, well, you actually have a provision in your zoning regulations which allows for open space developments. You've used it several times. And you've probably gained as much open space through that process as the planning commission has through the subdivision process. The development, the two developments on Allentown Road, one which is under construction on the north side, and one on the south side which was approved but has never been built, there are open space set-asides. These are not, they're not subdivisions, they're, for lack of a better term, they're cluster developments. And there was an instance in both of those where your regulations allow some increase in density in return for more open space. So there's an incentive on the part of your regulations to the developer to provide a little more design flexibility, a few more housing units in return for larger pieces of open space. You've gotten some significant open space through that process. And I know that open space you tend to think of, well, that's, you know, planning commission gets that through the subdivision process, or the city gets it by acquiring it. But you have a tool at your command to that's actually been very useful.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do we make a different, have a difference in definition between open space and green space?
No, not that I can think of. I mean, we typically have talked about open spaces, you know, and it's similar to the way that Glenn has talked about it.
Open space to me is, it remains undeveloped.
Right.
Green space means it could be part of a development area, but we're going to strive to make that development as green as possible.
Let me backtrack a little bit. Actually, you do, I don't know that we call it green space. One of the things that you have in your regulations, which I can tell you when I got here a long time ago, didn't have in your regulations, was the requirement for a certain level of landscaping in new development.
That's right.
You know,
Yep.
commercial development, not so much single-family residential development, but certainly multifamily development, industrial development, that you require a certain amount of green space in your regulations, in the parking lots primarily. So the end islands that you require and the buffer strips that you require all need to be greened up. And that helps a lot of things, but it provides, among other things, some relief from, you know, just this endless amount of asphalt. I think the best example that I can think of where that's made a very positive difference is the ShopRite shopping plaza. You've probably all been in town long enough to remember before they built a couple of new buildings and it was just all asphalt from one end to the other. You could go from point A to point B in that shopping center and it would just be through asphalt. There was no landscaping, no nothing. Well, you change your regulations and back in the early 1990s, and then I think it was 10, 12 years later, they came to us and to you and said we want to put up a couple of new buildings, and we're going to green this space up. We're going to put in end islands and landscaping strips, and they did it, and it does several things. It controls the traffic. It's a much more pleasant plaza. I don't know that any of us have ever been there when it wasn't crowded. That shopping plaza is always, always busy. And I'm not going to say, well, it's because it's green, but it's a nice experience. People like going to that plaza besides the fact that it's got some great stores that people want to shop at. It's a pleasant experience. It's shady, it's easy to get around, and so the long answer, but yeah, you've got, you have stuff in your regulations that requires that, and I think the smart developers understand the value of that.
The other illustration I think is a good one too is green spaces, the new school, the West Chickensville School. Remember the architect designed something between the school and all those homes so there wouldn't be a lot of asphalt back there. And that was good for those homes, because the homes kind of hedged on that school a little bit.
But, we're talking about changes in technology, and again, something that's kind of mundane, and we're beginning to see this, and it may be something that, translates from, a planning concept to a very practical regulation is lighting. I mean, you guys who, probably deal with this much more often, that, LED lights, which didn't exist, 20, 30 years ago, that's the wave, and the way in which parking lots are lighted now are different.
Downlighting, right, so that it doesn't go all up in the sky. ESPN's a good example of that, all their stuff, and that's another thing, is we somehow incorporate ESPN into this, because they're taking over that whole southeast corner of Bristol, and I envision that, all up Burt Street, they're going to be taking that whole place over eventually. I see it. But then maybe that's something to keep in our mind for how do we help them grow and how do we accommodate them in the future, because they're a great resource to Bristol, and we don't want to lose them.
And I think that they're sort of a quasi-institution in my mind, is that the types of issues that they're dealing with in terms of space expansion and their needs technologically and otherwise, to make that an observation on the plan that ESPN is important to the future of the community as well. I just wanted to pick up on what you had said. So what I actually crafted here for myself is this word open space doesn't have enough specificity to it. What I consider to be open space doesn't necessarily mean I agree with what you had. I think from listening to you talk, I think we're very similar. But there's other people who look at any undeveloped land in the city and say, oh, that's beautiful open space, and then a development comes in next to them and they say, you're going to take away the open space. It's not open space. It was somebody's property and it was undeveloped. And so we need to get people clued in to open space is something that we can and should preserve. Green space is something else to consider. LID is another strategy for consideration, I think, as part of the plan. LID is a drainage approach in philosophy. Historically, in terms of drainage, the idea was capture it, get it into a pipe, and get rid of it as quickly as possible, because I don't have to worry about it anymore. But what we learned is it changes the water table and it creates downstream problems and just flushes pollution where somebody else has to deal with it. So LID is a philosophy about trying to capture rainfall closer to where the raindrop falls and provide for pervious pavement and other types of treatment approaches which can be gentler and from an environmental perspective. So I think Bristol is interesting. There's places sort of in the urban downtown that retrofitting LID could be more of a challenge. But there's also other places in the community where we could, as part of redevelopment, even a ShopRite, they build the landscaped islands as what they call innies rather than outies, and the innies accept rainwater and can allow it to percolate and then overflow into the drainage system. So there's some different types of approaches that I think might be something for the plan to recommend, which would then eventually fall to the commission to adopt some regulations on, and that's again the type of thing that good coordination between the boards.
Let me throw out an open-ended question about everybody's favorite commercial road, Route 6. Did I get that right? But it's an important issue. It's the main east-west road through Bristol.
It's about to be widened.
It's about to be widened
That's right.
It's our needs.
at one end. Well, some say yes,
Oh.
some say no.
So sad state, isn't it?
But this commission, both the planning commission and this commission, have been pretty firm in the past 15 years about monitoring development on Route 6 and managing it and trying to not allow it to sort of spread and sprawl down the street. And I think in part this commission and the planning commission have agreed about where that development should be concentrated and where it should not be concentrated. And I think that's an issue that's going to come up again. So I think your take on that, I think even at this stage, would be very helpful.
Route 6, that Route 6 square is extremely important to the vitality of the city. We need those businesses, and it's very important to us. It's an important asset that we need to manage somehow properly. And I'm not sure that containing it is necessarily the right approach. I think if we could, we need to come up with some kind of a plan or a design or a strategy for allowing expansion of those businesses. Why do we want to try to keep them down and keep them? Because those businesses are lifeblood of the city. I mean, there's a lot of tax money comes into the city. A lot of people have jobs. I mean, it's a very important corridor. So I'm not sure that as a strategy we should say we've got to confine it. I think I'd like to see the planning commission come up with some idea about what we can do what strategy can we have for the future to try to encourage the growth of that business area rather than confine it.
How about access management? We've discussed this at the staff level many times, where the various curb cuts along Route 6 is I think, a detriment to Route 6.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get property owners to get together and share access, and you don't have as many curb cuts, I think that it would be beneficial to the project.
We did that at the Walgreens.
Well, a couple of things. One is you have access management in your regulations now for a portion of the Route 72 corridor. Okay. So you're familiar with the concept. And you've done it on an informal basis in a couple of locations along Route 6. And you're right, the Walgreens site was the best example of that, where they started, where you had a willing developer who said, I want to redevelop this site, I need to put up, I want to build a freestanding Walgreens, and I think went down from 4 curb cuts to 2. So I think the commission has encouraged it. It's always helpful if there's a planning policy that supports that. And certainly, and there was, when the Route 72 corridor study was done, there was a recommendation in that study that formed the basis of the access management provisions for Route 72. And you can take those provisions and use them anywhere in the city. And it may be that the Route 6 corridor is a place to do that, which may then make the ability for people to expand physically on their property or on the adjoining properties less scary to the commission, because it's not just another curb cut and another curb cut and another curb cut.
And safer for their customers.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that gets down to functionality.
And the other thing about Route 6 too, and this is only my opinion on it, I'm not so sure it has to be expanded, but I think what we have there should be used more. There's an awful lot of empty buildings on Route 6. Do we need to go down the streets and infringe on some of the residential areas when we have buildings that are available? You take the Wilco Plaza, I call it the Wilco Plaza because I'm the old guy.
That's a long time ago.
It's almost empty. It's almost completely empty. And, there's 5 or 6 buildings right there. You got the Blockbusters, it's empty. You got I believe behind Michael's Jewelers, there was a store that, I don't know if they ever filled that store. That was where the health store was at one time. There's a lot of facilities there that There's a lot of potential there on Farmington Avenue without infringing on the residents.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just dovetail, and I don't mean to monopolize the meeting here, but I was thinking about this before you spoke. We're talking about the future in 10 years, 15 years out. We're living in the Amazon.com age. And I don't want to throw a wet towel on the discussion, but we could foresee in 10 years from now, a lot of that retail space, there may even be more empty spaces. Folks are migrating, folks are buying stuff on the internet, they're not getting in their car, and so the need for the retail space might be even less, and that we're going to be left with a lot more empty spaces, maybe. I hope it doesn't happen.
And that's the long-term thinking that I appreciate, because I don't see it as restricting businesses in town as much as, staying within our zoning regulations, being true to the plan of conservation and development, and creating the character of Bristol by doing so, right? That's what we do. And I love ESPN, but I don't think that we should just bow to every request they have. We should look at it, analyze it, and see if it makes sense to the surrounding neighborhoods. Same thing with Farmington and Route 6. I think there's things that we could do with the curbs, they can expand on these empty lots eventually, tear it down and expand their businesses there. I just don't see them.
Well,
I
my
love
question
businesses
is,
too in Bristol, but just, short-term thinking of, let's not restrict them, so yeah, sure, let's encroach this neighborhood, this street.
No,
is short-term.
That's not what I was trying to say. What I'm saying is we need a plan that addresses Route 6, okay? And it has to go to the planning group. What do they see? And maybe it's the kind of thing that you're saying. Maybe in the plan that comes out, they're going to say, we foresee, the need for fewer buildings, and so so we don't want to expand, if you will. This is not the right words. Don't want to necessarily have an expansion of Route 6 because we've got empty buildings and we're going to have more, and this is not the way of the future. But I think that there needs to be, it needs to be addressed because it's an important asset for the city. And how do we manage it? And I think ESPN is the same way. I'm not saying to just give anybody free rein, but I'm saying these are things that are important to the city that ought to be addressed in a plan that we could then look at from our point of view and act or not act accordingly.
I think the key word that you used, and I think it's probably the most important one, is manage.
Right.
Is that and I think this commission has always tried to do that, certainly since the current zoning regulations were adopted, is that this is not a commission that stifles growth and stifles development. I think this is a commission that tries to manage it. There may be people who, disagree and feel that's a buzzword for controlling every little component of it. But I think in general, this commission tries to. Oops.
That's so soothing.
Hey, that's wonderful.
Time for your bills.
That's so mean.
That's not going to wake you up.
Time for my meds.
I think that is the key word, is that how do you manage, how do you encourage growth and development and at the same time manage it in a responsible way so that you...
And that's a question to the Planning Commission. How do you want to manage Route 6?
Yeah.
I think we're going to have this conversation. I think the interesting thing about Route 6, we already talked about access management, which is really sort of the coordination between sites in terms of maintaining appropriate access for each one, but trying to do it in the safest way possible that makes it also as efficient as possible. Because if everybody gets their own driveway, anarchy starts to result. But the other thing I think that in terms of following up on the management concept, how do you guys feel about the buffers or the transitions from commercial to residential? Do you think you have good provisions in place? Do you think we can or should be doing a better job? Because Route 6 is interesting along its length as to the depth of property. There are certain areas along Route 6 where the properties are deep, and as a result we can have a kind of a meaningful or consolidated development and actually have a little flexibility on buffers. There's other places that the depth is like one property deep, and there's really not, there's residences right behind. So How do you guys feel about those regulations? And do you think we can or should be looking to do a better job, or what do you think?
There was recently, I wasn't sitting on the vote, obviously, but we did have just something come up to the
True
board.
value.
Yes.
Yes.
And that was a difficult decision for this
Yeah, that was
commission.
But there are 3 other ones that we already did the same kind of thing. That
One was on King Street, I think.
one was on King Street, and the other one was on Farmington Avenue behind the restaurant there. The guy had
Right.
bought that house and used it for parking.
Did you feel, I mean, your regulations aren't always going to solve the problem for you, but do you think
Right.
your regulations gave you a good framework to find a good decision, or did you leave the decision feeling like, gosh, I wish we'd had better tools?
You know, we're kind of stuck with what we got out there, so, you know, we're going to have to manage again
Yeah.
through whatever permit which allows that to happen, whether
Yeah.
it's a zone change or however that's going to be. We have it established already. The difficulty we have in Bristol is the way that the Route 6 is laid out, with the house, like you said, houses so close. That's the majority of the problems out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't get the depth that you need in
No.
every location.
Exactly.
And I think the sort of the question, the policy question that Glenn is raising is, you know, are there going to be sites where you simply can't get the depth, and are there sites where you can, and, you know, is that okay, or do you want more uniform depth along the road, in which case do you allow, you know, the expansion of commercial development onto, you know, into the residential areas, and if so, how deep? You know, I think in general this commission's done a good job of trying to maintain Route 6 as the retail corridor, and not allowing it to go down the side streets. And when you've allowed it to go down the side streets, it's been as part of the development whose orientation was still Route 6. You didn't allow commercial development to not just march down the side streets, but to be oriented to the side streets. And I think that's kind of been the commission's solution so far, and it's worked. The question is it, you know, is that the best way to do
Even a
it?
single paragraph in the plan that reiterates the importance of trying to find effective buffers or transitions
Yeah,
from commercial to
exactly.
residential areas doesn't always result in a regulation, but if you do have good special permit criteria, as part of a special permit,
Yeah.
you can say to a developer, well, you know, our plan really pushes in the direction of trying to find an effective buffer. Can you do more?
Yeah, I would like to
And
see
that type of dialogue,
Yeah.
even if it's not a regulation, might be able to help you. So that's
I
good.
think that would be very helpful.
Good.
Yeah, it's an important enough of a corridor where it deserves that kind of attention.
And Alan has talked many times in the office, forgive me for divulging private staff conversations, but the Liberty Bank...
You're fired later.
That's where I was going to think that